Urban Planning Delegated Committee. Before we commence the meeting, I request that all mobile telephones are turned off or switched to silent. Thank you. Given the recent changes to the COVID-19 restrictions, councillors are able to be present for the meeting this evening. This meeting is being live streamed on the council website to enable the community to view the proceedings. Should technical problems be encountered during the meeting will be adjourned until the problem is rectified, or if needed, the meeting will be postponed. My name is Councillor Jim Park and I chair this committee. I'll start by introducing my fellow councillors and officers. Seated to my left at the horseshoe table, the Mayor, Councillor Gary Thompson, Councillor Susan Bigger, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Nick Stavrou, Councillor Felicity Sinfield. On the opposite side, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, Councillor Di Gillies, Councillor Jane Addis and Councillor Victor Franco. Officers in attendance tonight are Philip Storer, the Chief Executive Officer, who's seated behind Councillor Gillies, Simon Mitchell, the Manager of Strategic and Statutory Planning, who's seated to my right, David Thompson, the Manager of Governance and Legal, who's seated to my left, and Elizabeth Manu, who's a Senior Governance Officer, who's seated further to my left. There are also a number of other officers in attendance this evening, and they'll be introduced as they present their reports. Essentially, the purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with the report, which includes a summary of the objections received. For those in the gallery presenting this evening, when we come to the agenda item, it will be introduced by an officer. I'll then call you one by one to come forward and address the committee. If you are making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please don't repeat what earlier speakers have said, and keep your submission focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you are opposed to the planning application, please inform the committee why you are opposed and suggest an alternative approach which would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or detail in the officer's report. Note that there is a strict time limit of 3 minutes for each speaker, including councillors, and whilst as chairperson I reserve the right to vary that time, I seldom do. I'll ask speakers to stand at the lectern and those against the recommendation to speak first, followed by those in favour. At the 2.5 minute mark, you'll hear the bell ring, and that will indicate that you have 30 seconds remaining to conclude your presentation. Turning now to the agenda, apologies. Mr Thompson, have we received any apologies for the meeting?
Through you, Mr Chair, we have an apology from Councillor Galt for tonight's meeting. Thank
you. That takes us to item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the meeting held on 1 March 2021. I'm in search of a mover, Councillor Hollingsworth, and that's seconded by Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Yes.
Is there any discussion? Then I'll put that motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Item 2 is declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or councillor officer. Are there any declarations? No. I have one in respect of item 3.1, 1207 Burke Road Q. I have a general conflict of interest under section 127 as the registered proprietor of real estate in close proximity to the subject site. That then takes us to item 3, and the first item there is 3.1, heritage protection of 1207 Burke Road Q. So I will vacate the chair at this point.
For the benefit of the people watching online and for members of the gallery, given that the Chair, Councillor Park, has declared a conflict of interest in this particular matter, it's therefore inappropriate for him to chair this particular item. So, councillors, I'm in search for a nomination for the position of temporary chairperson. Councillor Sinfield.
Mr Thompson, I would like to nominate Councillor Thompson as the most immediate past chair of this committee.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Watson. So
Yes.
second.
Yep, second.
Councillor Thompson, do you accept the... Sorry, Mr Mayor, do you accept the nomination?
I do, Mr Thompson, thank you.
Are there any further nominations? There being no further nominations, I declare the Mayor, Councillor Thompson, elected as temporary chairperson.
So we'll now move on to item 3.1, Heritage Protection of 1207 Burke Road, Kew, preliminary consultations and outcomes. And the presenting officer will be Miss Amanda Seymour, Senior Strategic Planner. Thank you.
Thank you. So tonight, officers are seeking the Urban Planning Delegated Committee's adoption of the Heritage Citation for 1207 Burke Road, Kew, and a resolution to proceed with a planning scheme amendment to include the property in a heritage overlay on a permanent basis. The house at 1207 Burke Road has been recommended for heritage protection under criterion H of the heritage criteria for its association with B.A. Santa Maria. B.A. Santa Maria was a leading figure in the Catholic Church and an important figure in Australian public life through much of the 20th century. Preliminary consultation on the draft heritage citation for 1207 Burke Road was undertaken from the 7th of January to the 8th of February 2021. Council received 57 submissions, including 3 supporting submissions and 54 submissions, 3 objecting submissions and 54 supporting submissions. The submissions received have been reviewed by officers and Council's heritage consultant. Despite the objections received, Council's heritage consultant continues to believe that 1207 Burke Road is of local heritage significance for its association with B.A. Santa Maria and should be included in the heritage overlay. If the Urban Planning Delegated Committee decides to adopt the heritage citation and proceed with the planning scheme amendment to include the property in a heritage overlay on a permanent basis tonight, officers will commence the formal planning scheme amendment process. There will be further opportunities for residents and the owners to make submissions to Council as part of the formal exhibition process, and opportunities for Council to make refinements to the heritage citation during the formal planning scheme amendment process. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Councillors, we've got 3 speakers tonight, 1 for and 2 against. I'll call forward our first speaker, Miss Christina Brannigan. And Ms Brannigan, if we can start with your name and address and followed by your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Sure. My name's Christina Brannigan. I live at 61 Brinsley Road in Camberwell. Good evening, everybody. I'm here tonight to support the officer's recommendations and to mention some of the thoughts from a couple of local residents of Kew and Camberwell with whom I've spoken to who strongly support the house being protected. We're very grateful that the officers have investigated the house and are willing to support its protection. We're hoping that you, the councillors, will vote tonight to give this place long-term preservation. Council's heritage experts, who include expert historians, have clearly evidenced, we think, that the house meets the individually significant threshold via historical significance, criterion H. Mr Santa Maria was a person of significance to Australia, to Victoria and to Boroondara's history, and he undertook much of his work at the house, where he also met with people of significance to Australia's history. It would seem that his influence on the political and religious landscape of post-war Australia shouldn't be underestimated, and that his influence can still be felt today. One of our most esteemed historians, Professor Geoffrey Blaney, obviously considers him to have had great influence. He stated in his book, A Shorter History of Australia, Mr Santa Maria did not sit in an Australian parliament. He had no need for one. I also wanted to mention a couple of facts that 2 concerned Boroondara residents have shared with me. Firstly, regarding the importance of the work of Mr Santa Maria and the connections to Boroondara. He was particularly significant in the formation of the Democratic Labour Party and the National Civic Council, which is still apparently headquartered in Boroondara. Much of the wider activist work that he was involved in was centred around Kew. Journalist Peter Coleman said Santa Maria was one of the 3 most influential personalities in Australian politics since the Second World War, along with the then Prime Minister Robert Menzies and former Labour Party leader Bert Evett. According to journalist Greg Sheridan, Mr Santa Maria was offered a knighthood by the Prime Minister at that time, Malcolm Fraser, but he declined it. We know that Prime Minister John Howard visited Mr Santa Maria shortly before he died at his home and also offered a state funeral to his family, which was held at St Patrick's Cathedral. So what's the evidence of Mr Santa Maria's influence in Boroondara? Well, many residents apparently would have tuned into his weekly TV programme Point of View, which screened on Channel 9 for over 30 years, or read his regular column in The Australian. Another legacy to the citizens of Boroondara was apparently his personal negotiation in the 1960s for Commonwealth and Victorian government funding for the large number of independent schools that we know we have in Boroondara, both Catholic and non-Catholic. So during the 1960s, he negotiated with the Prime Minister Robert Menzies and his Treasurer Harold Holt to get federal aid, not just for Catholic schools, but for all independent schools in Australia. And he also convinced Premier Henry Bolt to give payments for each child attending an independent school in Victoria. So from the mid-1960s to the present day, all the parents of children and the students attending independent schools in Boroondara have benefited from Bob's initiative. So I think we can tonight be confident as a city that the heritage experts, the historians and the community have gathered enough strong evidence to protect the house as an individually significant house under criterion H, the historical criterion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Brannigan, for your presentation. Just before you leave the lectern, councillors, are there any questions for Ms Brannigan? There doesn't appear any. You may return to the gallery. Thank you. We'll call forward our second presenter, Mr Greg Price, to the lectern. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Greg Price from 2A Breena Road in Glen Iris. I'm speaking against the proposed heritage overlay on the grounds that I think the threshold is essentially hasn't been reached. Although, Bob, who was, did significant work in the community and things like that, he only wrote 3 of his 9 books, there, and supposedly, paced up and down the driveway. Now we all do our work in various places, and there are a lot of people that do significant work in our community and our state. So there comes the point where it's like, how do you go and judge, what properties we protect? And it leads to a more fundamental question about how will the public enjoy or benefit from the preservation of this private property. It is a private residence. It's not like it's a publicly owned property where people can go and visit or it's got some significance. So what is the actual benefit or point in going and applying controls to it when it's private property? There's also the larger issue of who do we go and apply do this sort of thing to, like when it comes to journalists, political figures and religious figures. It's like, how would people feel if Pauline Hanson was in the electorate? Or do we apply it to every MP? Or, perhaps leaders of parties, or perhaps even every mayor, because they do significant work. So there comes a threshold as far as, who is significant enough. Speaking that I'm in the early part of my 50s, I didn't know about him before, and when you look at the time frames that he did his work in, it's like it's older people who would know or find him significant, and hence, is there really any merit in providing permanent controls in a place where a lot of the community, while they might have benefited from some of his work, aren't actually aware of him, and there are many, many other people who have done equally significant work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Price. Thank you, Mr Price. Councillors, are there any questions for Mr Price? There doesn't appear to be any. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you. We'll call forward our last presenter this evening, Mr William Pearce, if you can come forward, please. And Mr Pearce, when you're ready, if we can just commence with your name and address, thank you, and then your presentation.
Thank you. My name is William Pearce. I'm a director of a planning and urban design firm called Human Habitats, and I represent the landowner in this case. My address is Suite 424, 838 Collins Street in Docklands. Thank you for the opportunity to present tonight on behalf of the owners of the land. Firstly, I want to congratulate this council on the great work it has done in preparing and implementing effectively gap studies across the municipality, implementing heritage overlays and protecting valued assets within the community, built form fabric and cultural fabric. As recently as in early March, there were 3 amendments that were approved by the Minister for Planning and implemented into the planning scheme, showing that work has been effective because heritage is a very, very important thing to our city and indeed the city of Boroondara, where I grew up. 1207 Burke Road and the streetscape was looked at as part of these gap studies, and none of the work that was prepared as part of these gap studies identified that either the fabric of the building or the streetscape was of any value, and indeed the fact that it isn't in a heritage overlay now as a result of that significant strategic work that this council has done confirms that. The proposal that's before you tonight relies on new information that BA Santa Maria lived at 1207 Burke Road. Our client has sought their own advice, which I've circulated to each of you, which counters the views of the advice that council has commissioned. And in essence, I mean, there's a bit to this, but it relies on one set of criterion. The main argument that I want to draw your attention to that's been presented by our heritage architect and historian, who's a well-known architect and heritage historian that this council has commissioned in the past for its own gap study work, is that there is no direct link with the fabric of the building and with BA Santa Maria. There's no evidence of him living in the premises, and in fact the only thing that draws a link between him and the city of Boroondara is the fact that he lived on that site for a long period of time. It is arguable that each of you will have more to do with Boroondara's history in your tenure here at council than he ever has. His influence was much greater than that, and I guess the argument is that there is no direct connection between his contribution in society, which I don't question, and the city of Boroondara itself. So we're here today to say...
Mr Pearce, if you can start to wrap up your presentation.
Thank you. To stop this amendment in its tracks and conserve your resources, which are valuable in protection of the real heritage of Boroondara. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Pearce. Before you go, colleagues, are there any questions for Mr Pearce? Nope, there doesn't appear to be. Thank you for your presentation. We'll now turn to matters arising. Officers.
Thank you. So thank you to everyone for your submissions tonight. There's only a few things that are probably worth reiterating. So one of the presenters tonight had talked about how significant Santa Maria was, and in this regard the heritage consultants have assessed the property against the Victorian Heritage Register's criteria and threshold guidelines, and after that assessment they concluded that the property did meet the threshold for heritage protection. The other 2 key things relate to the property's aesthetic and architectural value. So these things were considered by Council's heritage consultant, and they determined that the property doesn't have individual architectural or aesthetic value, so it doesn't have a streetscape value, but it does have an associative significance to Bob Santa Maria, which elevates the property's heritage value and makes it of heritage significance to the city of Boroondara. The last thing that's probably worth talking about is protection, whether there's something to protect in the building fabric that represents Bob Santa Maria. This is something that our heritage consultants have considered a number of times, and their view is that the building itself, whilst it might not have his name written on the front of it, it still represents him and an aspect of his life, and that the built form has value in terms of its heritage association with Bob Santamaria and is worthy of protection.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of officers on this item? I think that's it. I'll come to you in a second, Councillor Franco. Councillor Synthfield.
Thanks, Mayor. No questions. Ready to move a motion when the time is right.
Thank you. Councillor Franco.
Thanks. Mr. Price raised a point in his discussion about private properties versus public properties, and there's a sense in which if the heritage value of the property is in its cultural association, yet apologies, sorry, I was distracted. If the heritage fabric is the heritage value of the property is in its social aspects, yet the building is closed and a private residence, there's probably potentially an issue there. But I'd like to understand whether there is anything in the heritage controls in respect of that issue or that principle, and whether that carries any merit in terms of our considerations and deliberations in relation to the matter.
Councillor Franco, just for the gallery's benefit, I think they weren't able to hear you.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? I'm happy to try. You can hear me now? Okay. I was raising a question in relation to the point raised by Mr. Price in his presentation, where he drew a distinction between potentially the private nature of the property versus it being publicly accessible, and whether the fact of its heritage value being a social one primarily, and the fact that the building isn't publicly available in the form of a gallery or a space for the community to enjoy. Now, whether there's anything in the planning controls or in guidelines or anything in respect of that we need that we should be taking into account, or any guidance in respect of that. So I think it's an interesting point that he makes.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So one of the criterion that we can assess places against for inclusion in the heritage overlay is associative significance, and that is what this property is determined to have met. So it is purely the associative. That link between built form and built fabric and protecting place on its social significance is on the premise that the place is representative of the place that the person of importance resided in, particularly at a time when they were doing their important work. This issue of protecting private properties for public benefit falls under this, I guess, the principle of custodianship that council has in terms of protecting and preserving places as representation of a history of the locality. And in this instance, the property itself, setting aside architectural value, is considered to have met that threshold as a representation of a place linked to a person of importance to the city of Boroondara. It's less about whether the community can enter any of these properties. These places can be enjoyed from the public realm, and you would, of course, see many places being protected. It's not uncommon, I should say, that places are protected for social significance where the public cannot access the property. An example of that is a property that was identified in the Camberwell Heritage Gap Study that was adopted by council in the last 2-3 years and proceeded to be protected through the heritage overlay on social significance alone.
Got a follow-up, or you? Just your light on there, Councillor Franco.
I have another question in relation to the internal fabric and whether it's intact and whether that should have any bearing on our consideration. And if we were to approve this interim, I mean, presumably it can still go to an independent panel if the owner requests that, is my understanding, but separately, would that provide an opportunity or time to reconsider the internal fabric, and to what extent do we need to consider the internal fabric?
So you may be aware that the citation identifies a library within the home as being important, and for that reason internal controls are being considered here. We do need to confirm that through a site inspection. We tried to gain access to the property as part of preliminary consultation, was unable to, but we can certainly confirm that through the amendment process. However, just bringing it back to the recommendation for protection, it is based on associative significance, so regardless of whether the library exists or not, the associative significance remains, and that's the basis of which we are, or the heritage consultant is recommending it be protected.
Sorry, excuse me, Mr Chair, just to add to that, yes, there'll be a number of occasions where this matter's brought back before the UPDC for a decision.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just wanted to talk a little bit about the value of provenance, which I think has just been answered in the question about social significance, and the interpretation of provenance refers to obviously the history of the owners, but also the built form fabric and the intactness of the home. And my understanding of the report is that this is quite significant in all those categories. So the question I have is, when Mr Price spoke, he talked about our heritage of how do we put a value on heritage when we don't know who lived in the home before. Largely, I would say most of the homes in Berendara that have heritage protection is not commonly known by the general public of who lived there. But regardless of that, if there is history and provenance of the significance of the home, then that in itself is the important factor here, regardless of any identification to the home. So I just wanted to clarify that of the interpretation of provenance. Am I correct in my understanding?
I think the answer is yes.
Yes, it is. Just again, to come back to that principle of criterion H, it is about associative significance and social significance. So it is about the person that resided in the place. And in particular, the test is at what point in their lifetime were they living in that home, and is it linked to the time in which they were undertaking work that they are noted for? So that's the connection there.
Criterion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Just checking, Councillor Sinfield, that's reserving your right still. Thank you. Councillor Bigger.
Yes, thank you. So I just had a question about when you were summing up your 3 points. The first one, I think, was to say that it had been assessed against what I believe you said was historical meaning guidelines, meaning BA Santa Maria's sort of meeting a threshold of important enough person. Can you just, is that, am I right in understanding, is that what you meant? And can you tell us anything more about that?
Yeah, so yeah, that is correct. So there's a threshold or guidelines that were put out by the Victorian Heritage Council that lists criteria that heritage consultants would have regard to when assessing a place for social significance. The 4 criteria are a direct association with the person, a strong contribution to the course of history, an association to the place is evidence in the physical fabric or in an oral history. And the last one is the place relates to the achievements of the person. So when assessed against that criteria, the heritage consultants determined that the property met all of those tests because it has a strong association with the course of his life when he was, undertaking, his books and various presentations and those kinds of activities. And after that assessment, they deemed that it was of heritage value.
can I just follow on? So then just to clarify, so it really is a combination of both assessing the connection between him and the property, but also assessing his own importance. Sort of, it's not one or the other, it really is both, and that is, they're both things that you would say that where they have said that he has met that criteria, it has met that criteria.
Yes, so they do consider, they do consider the person themselves, like how significant they are and whether they had a significant enough influence in public life to warrant their property being registered as a place of significance for its association with that person. So they did consider how significant that person was, as well as the factors of how it relates to the built form and the building itself.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Thank you. And with the discretion here as Chair, I'm going to ask a couple of questions myself, if I can, please. Criterion H, you've touched on that it's got social significance or associative significance. I think the architectural historian David Bick, in his report for the applicant, outlined that there was no material effect on the fabric of the building. So the way that that applies can be either one, it affects the fabric of the building, or it doesn't, and that's not the delineation. So it doesn't have to affect the fabric of the building. That's what we're sort of saying.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So it doesn't have to. There doesn't have to be something physically built. It can just be the fact that it represents a course or a part of their life, and it, you know, the heritage consultants, for instance, they sort of put forward the argument that the building itself shows it is a family home, and whilst it might not have direct associations with his political, you know, actives and activities, it still represents a part of his life, and the built fabric is part of that history and that process. Yeah.
So notwithstanding that this property didn't have the architectural aesthetic at the time to trigger the heritage gap study, if it was, I mean, it's quite an attractive building in its own right, but if it was less attractive than it is currently, Criterion H still applies?
Yes.
Yep, okay. Thank you. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you. When the time is right, and it appears to be now that questions have been exhausted, I'd like to move the officer's recommendation as displayed on the screen, please.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Sinfield, is there a seconder? Councillor Hollingsworth. Is there anyone in opposition to Councillor Sinfield's motion? Councillor Addis?
I think I'm in opposition for the purpose of debate. I'm not sure where I want to land on this one.
Sure. Councillor Sinfield as the mover, would you like to speak to your motion?
I'd be delighted to. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Councillor Addis, for indulging me and making sure that I earn my money here tonight. Can I just check the audio? The gallery's happy now? Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you to everyone seated in the gallery who has attended tonight on both sides of the debate. It's so important that we hear from the community, and this really is an example of the power of the people, because like one of our speakers, I'm too young to have known BA Santa Maria's influence firsthand. If it hadn't been for the community coming forward and informing me of this, then I would be naive to the history and to his influence. Without the community bringing matters like this to our attention, unfortunately, there are houses that are missed and there are morsels of history that are missed. And while we do have a fantastic heritage gap study underway across the municipality, and we have identified many properties because of that, unfortunately, the test and the work that is done is largely done either by desktop or by going past these properties without the intrusive test of history and knowing who in fact lived there and what went on behind those walls. And could you imagine if those walls could speak? To just simply say that Bartholomew Augustine Santa Maria was coming for dinner or you were going to his house would be such an amazing thing. What a phenomenal person to have to dinner or to visit, and I would have loved to have been more aware many years ago when he was residing there. Might have knocked on his door and said g'day. quite an amazing history he had, because he didn't need a seat in Parliament to be as influential as he was. In fact, he could do better work and be more influential from outside of either state or federal Parliament. And I think that's quite an amazing achievement in itself, to be one of the most influential people in history. Now, I understand that Councillor Addis and maybe others may have some reservations about the strengths of the grounds upon which this matter comes to us tonight. And as the Mayor just pointed out, it wasn't significant enough to be worthy of an individual significant citation, and it is on the history that it comes to us. My dream, or one of my dreams of the future of the City of Boroondara, is in fact a walking tour where you could snap a QR code with your phone, and as you walk past these places and see that they're heritage protected and that they have amazing history that you can read about or listen to a podcast on as you're walking around the neighbourhood. And this is an example of one of those that you may not stop at the front gate. It might catch your eye. You might think that, yes, it's part of the rhythm of the street, but without knowing the history and the amazing people who have lived behind these front fences, sadly we drive around the suburbs naive to it. So the notes and anecdotes and morsels of history that have been emailed through and relayed over phone calls and so forth from the community have led us to this point tonight. I commend the officer's recommendation to you and thank the community again for their participation in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Are there any other councillors wishing to speak to this item? Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Mr Mayor. I think the trouble I have with this is that Boroondara is chock-a-block full of notable, special people, and I wonder where this starts and finishes if every notable person who's had an influence on our community leads to a house that really doesn't visually have heritage value, is assigned a significant rating. And it seems to me that that we don't actually need the house to be there for us to know that a famous person lived in our municipality. We could go on a heritage walk, and without the house being there, we could be told about the importance of the person who lived there. The difficulty I have is that the person isn't reflected in the visual appearance of the property. I suspect I might vote in favour of this motion, but only because we're at the start of a process, and I feel that given we've got this far, we do have more opportunities to have this tested at the panel and to consider it again. But I really am struggling with where this will end if this is the basis we use. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. I've got Councillor Gillies next.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Whilst I appreciate that this particular case does still need to be tested in the process, I believe that protection of heritage properties is very important, and it's important to our local and our wider society. And what we're looking at here is consistent with our current plan, our council plan, and with our community plan, and specifically with it's compliant with the strategies that seek to preserve the history of the city, both its social and its physical. I hear what Councillor Addis is saying, but I still believe that the physical presence has a huge part to play in that. And I believe that protecting 1207 Burke Road may well be in keeping with that. As with Councillor Sinfield, I thank members of the community for their interest, their research and their attention to sites that are at risk. And I support the formal process as outlined in the report be followed. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Councillor Franco.
Thank you. My views were reflected in the comments made by Councillor Addis. I won't repeat them all, but I do feel a little bit uneasy about protecting heritage fabric on the built form based on an association that is tenuous at best, it seems, in the argument. So it's a challenging one, and I'd like to understand it. Like Councillor Addis, I may vote in favour with a view to, with an understanding that it can still be reviewed and it's the commencement of a process, but I do have some reservations, and I'm very well aware of BA Santa Maria, having grown up, being made to watch Point of View as a young child, so I wonder whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's very much in the forefront of my memories as a child. But I don't think that is something that in itself necessarily relates to the built form, and going further and applying internal heritage controls on something where there's best a tenuous relationship, I don't know how we can comfortably justify that, but I'd like to understand a bit further on that.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. I have Councillor Watson next.
Thank you. I'll be brief. At the start of the last council term, there were 6 properties identified. They were the farmhouses of Balwyn, and there was one of them that was in a street behind me, in Kenny Street, who had a connection with one of the original founding people in Balwyn, Mr. Tout, and it was really heartbreaking to see that loss of history and that loss of connection with the foundation of Balwyn, because we could only save one of them. So with this property coming before us tonight, I'm in favour of supporting the officer's recommendation because I think it's important for it to go towards a panel. With all of these things, it's about balance. I think it's not necessarily about one thing over and above another. I think we need to understand the connections between the two. So looking on it at the property on architectural merit, I do find it of merit. And for me, the connection with history is also of merit. So I support what's before us tonight. And just to use a little example of the farmhouses of Balwyn, as sometimes when we look, I think when we lean too much on just built form, there are some wonderful connections that we lose. And unfortunately, the farmhouses of Balwyn are lost.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Next, I have Councillor Hollingsworth, a seconder.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Also be fairly brief. Upon comments just discussed this evening, I thought of a moment only months back where I was at a cafe in Mailing Road, and there was a group of people that had travelled over from England, and they said, "We're excited to be here, but we're also extremely upset." And they explained that they were watching the Sullivan series on TV, and they actually came to Canterbury to look at the various buildings that were filmed in that series. So fortunately, through the Heritage Gap study, we've recently managed to include the Sullivan Milk Bar on Matlock Street, which is a beautiful heritage building. But unfortunately, prior to Gap study, the actual original home that the Sullivans was filmed in, the house that they lived in, was demolished and it's now gone. And so the people talked about the wonderful history we have within Australia and did various films that they've watched, or series or programs, but expressed why did we not save that house, because it was so significant because of film but also because of architecture. And so I look at this particular home and I see it does have a lot of architectural integrity. It is largely intact. If it was in a location where there were connecting homes and it could have formed a precinct, there was no doubt this house would actually be included in it. But unfortunately, it didn't have that standalone significance on its own to hold its own weight back when prior gap studies were done. So with the information that's been brought to us, and I absolutely applaud those people that have brought the additional history merit to us and provided all the information, this has now been given a second opportunity, and I will strongly be supporting this, and thank all the councillors for their comments, and in particular the ward councillor. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I too, I think heritage and buildings sometimes form really a three-dimensional library for us to remember history, and I certainly have learned much about Boroondara through some of the heritage issues. One learns a lot about, for example, our views in the 19th century on how we protect the disabled with Kew cottages and things like that. But Councillor Adders makes some great points, and coming into the chamber tonight, I did some research and I've been thinking a bit about this. And one of the things that really makes me or inclines me to support this in a strong way is that a lot of what I read about Mr. Santa Maria is really about his importance in Australian life. And one of the articles, quite interesting, came from The Conversation, and I read that article because it had a very most interesting title. And the title, if I may, was Bob Santa Maria, the most significant figure in Australian politics never to have been in Parliament. Now, in some ways, these words have been said before, but not in the way that it was said. A professor of humanities and social inquiry has written that article, and when you read the article, you understand his importance in cultural, religious and other matters and political matters, and his importance to the community with how he got funding for schools and etc., which is a local issue. And I think a person of that significance, preserving their house, conversations like this would actually aid the memory. So contrary to what was said a bit earlier, not knowing him and actually having the presence and conversations to remind us of sometimes really gives a real reason why the Heritage Act is there, to actually continue to remind us of these things, because otherwise, in some sense, all heritage is social, because without our memory, it's gone. So on that basis, I would certainly want to support that.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. And before I hand back to the mover, I'm also just foreshadowing that I'll support this. Whilst I accept criterion H associative or social significance is a little bit subjective, and there's a fine line between who's significant in our social and cultural development of Boroondara. I think this one with Santa Maria is not unclear. He's been very significant. And I'll just use this opportunity. I might foreshadow something in general business when we get to general business on this. But I'll hand back to the mover to round out the debate.
Thanks, Mayor. Just a couple of things to recap on. Thank you, everyone, for your contribution tonight. I think, as Councillor Stavrou just said, it is these conversations that keep these memories and histories alive, and the citation will now be discoverable on the internet, and people will be able to, to do further research on him and on the house. It is unfortunate that it doesn't form part of the precinct around the Sackville Street area. Sadly, that precinct is broken, and there are too many houses lost in between, but the architecture is very similar to many properties built in that area. Our community expectations are really important to me, and as Councillor Gillies touched on, our community plan and the research that we've done with our community highlights the importance of protecting such properties. And I accept that it's not the property that's being protected for its visual beauty or its significance from the streetscape, but because of criterion H. Now, criterion H exists for a reason. It exists because we have these gems of history across Boroondara and across Victoria. And it's not a criterion that gets exercised as often as the others, but it's there as one of the 8 important reasons to protect property. And I'm delighted that we're heading down that path tonight. As as a former colleague has said on many occasions in this chamber, in Councillor Coral Ross, once it's gone forever, and it can't be reinstated. So I thank my colleagues for their contribution tonight and look forward to seeing this progress through to the next phase. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. I'll now put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. I'll now vacate the chair, and if we can ask for Councillor Park to rejoin and resume the chair. Thank you.
Okay, councillors, that takes us to item 4, general business. Are there any items of general business? Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Yeah, just as foreshadowed during debate previously, I'd like to seek officers and councillors to have a discussion on social significant criterion H. There may be some properties that we're very much unaware of for socially significant individuals in our municipality. So at officers' discretion, we'll have a CP&D.
Thank you. Are there any other items of general business? Item 5, urgent business. Are there any items of urgent business? Item 6, confidential business. Are there any items of confidential business? I therefore declare the meeting closed. Thank you.